This short talk is an introduction to where people might be buried. This is one of the questions we are asked most often, and actually one of the hardest to answer, because there is no central repository of burial records. The place of burial is not mentioned on the death certificate, and people could actually be buried far away from where they died. Also, there is no one-size-fits-all. Each place followed its own path regarding which records were kept, but I hope to give you some clues as to where you can look to find out where your ancestors might have been buried. I am concentrating on the area of Greater London which is looked after by us, the London, Westminster and Middlesex Family History Society, as this is our area of expertise. This is the area we look after. It is the City of London and the London boroughs of Barnet, Brent, Camden, Enfield, Haringey, Harrow, Islington and Westminster, plus parts of Ealing and Hillingdon. We also cover the town of Potters Bar and the surrounding area, which are part of Hertfordshire. This area was the parish of South Mimms, which was originally in Middlesex, but transferred to Hertfordshire in 1965. That's the way things are now, but historically, there were 41 ancient parishes in Middlesex, 3 in Hertfordshire, plus another 115 in the City of London. And it is the parish records we need to go as a rule to find burial records from before about 1850. And it is to these earlier records that I am going first in this talk. Parishes are each based around one church, and those belonging to our ancient parishes were generally founded in medieval days. Of course, as this is London, it is not quite as simple as that. The parishes of Westminster, for instance, were mainly taken from the original one, St Margaret's, a little later than this, but the 41 parishes in Middlesex, the 3 in Hertfordshire and the 115 in the City of London were all formed before 1750. Their churches were each surrounded by churchyards, and it was here, or inside the church, that parishioners were interred. A peaceful resting place for all time, we like to think, and there for descendants to find. The reality of the matter is, of course, much more complicated than that. Regarding the 44 parishes of Middlesex and Hertfordshire, you can still see part or all of the churchyards surrounding the 44 churches. Some, especially our more out-of-town parishes, were just as you would imagine they had for centuries. The church, okay, it may have been restored, rebuilt, expanded and so on, surrounded by a churchyard packed with gravestones, such as this one at Ickenham. So about half of the 44 parishes only had one parochial burial ground, meaning that anyone you see in the burial register of that parish must have been interred in the churchyard surrounding that church. These parishes are Chipping Barnet, East Barnet, Edgware, Friern Barnet, Great Stanmore, Greenford, Hampstead, Harefield, Hendon, Ickenham, Little Stanmore, Monk and Hadley, Northolt, Perivale, Pinner, St Anne Soho, St Clement Danes, St Martin in the Fields, Tottenham, Totteridge, Wembley and West Twyford. Burial registers have survived well for these churches, with the earliest being Ickenham, starting in 1536, and the latest at Kingsbury, which started in 1732. Sometimes, often, the churchyards would become full and the parochial graveyard would have to be extended and or an additional ground commissioned. More on that later. Our ancient parish churches were mainly founded in medieval times, and so it is likely that local people will have been buried in the churchyards from this time. There isn't much we can find out if our ancestors were buried in a place before the registers began, and it is most unlikely that a gravestone would have lasted this long out in all weathers. So I'm not going to talk about these early deaths beyond saying that if you had very wealthy ancestors, it is possible that there may be a brass memorial. This brass is hidden away in a rather dark corner of St Mary at Monk and Hadley, hence the rather dodgy photo, but it is dated 1442, making it older than the church building it is in. The entry in a burial register will typically have the name of the deceased with the number of the entry, an address of sorts, the date of burial, the age at death, and the name of the person who performed the ceremony. Let's look at an example. I'm staying with Monk and Hadley for this. This image comes from the burial register of St Mary and is dated 1858. The original registers are at London Metropolitan Archives, and they have been digitised and can be found on Ancestry. You can see here that William Beck of Hadley was buried on the 23rd of January 1858, aged 14 months, by George Proctor, rector. William Bailey of Hadley was buried on the 8th of February, aged 16, and Henry Nathaniel Poulton on the 27th of February, aged only 8 months. These names appear in the burial register, so we can be sure that they were buried in the churchyard here. But can we find out any more about these burials? Maybe pinpoint exactly where these children were buried? Well, the answer is maybe. There are several places you can look for more information. In the first place, it might be worth looking in the parish chest. I will explain what this is in case you are unfamiliar with the term. All of the records generated by a parish used to be kept in a locked chest in the church. This example is actually from Chipping Barnet, and these archives are now known as parish chest records. Apart from the registers of baptisms, marriages, burials, and related records, items concerning the poor law, including rates, an assortment of other material would be included, and much of it may be of use to the family historian. Parish magazines might also be here. These started around the mid-19th century, and their content varied with what the author thought his parishioners ought to know about. They can include sermons, religious and secular stories, articles on thrift and health, and community news, including the last month's baptisms, marriages, and burials. Survival is patchy, but they can usually be found in parish chest archives or at local record offices. The Hadley burial registers are at LMA, and usually parish chest items are kept with them. However, LMA only has a trustee's minute book for the Sunday school and choir boys charity dated 1797 to 1954, a church council minute book for 1928 to 1942, and a visitor's book dated 1961 to 1980, none of which is relevant to burials in the churchyard. It is worth checking with the local record office too. Our record office for the London as a whole is LMA, but each borough has one as well. For Monk and Hadley, that is Barnet Local Studies and Archives. They have various poor law records, although most are perhaps unexpectedly at Hertfordshire Archives and Local Studies. Although Monk and Hadley has never been in Hertfordshire, it became part of the London Borough of Barnet in 1965, and Barnet has been in Herts, though that must be why. Many other poor law records from St Mary at Monk and Hadley are actually in Barnet Museum, but here again, there is nothing which refers to burials. Another place worth considering is the local Family History Society, in this case, us. Of our 44 parishes, 19 have churchyards still full of gravestones, and 15 of these had their monumental inscriptions recorded by us in the 1980s. What this means is that we captured a snapshot in time of how the gravestones were around 40 years ago. The results were all published on microfiche, and the parishes we covered were, alphabetically, East Barnet, Edgware, Edmonton, Enfield, Finchley, Free and Barnet, Great Stanmore, Harrow on the Hill, Kingsbury, Little Stanmore, Monk and Hadley, Northolt, Perivale and Ruislip. We are gradually revisiting these churchyards to photograph the gravestones and check the inscriptions. Of the ones we have checked, we have found additions and corrections to existing stones, the emergence of rose gardens where ashes can be buried and commemorated with small plaques. Looking in our memorial inscription booklet for Monk and Hadley, for these 3 children who were buried at Monk and Hadley, neither of the babies is commemorated on a gravestone, but William Bailey, aged 16, is. Here it is. The inscription reads, "In memory of William, son of Thomas and Sophia Bailey of this parish. He died February the 1st, 1858, aged 16 years. Those who seek me early shall find me." Proverbs 4, verse 17. Also in memory of Thomas Bailey, father of the above, who died December the 25th, 1882, aged 75 years. "There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God." Hebrews 4, verse 9. Also in memory of Sophia Bailey, who died November the 17th, 1884, aged 78 years. "Them also who sleep in Jesus will God bring with him." Thess 1, verse 14. Also in memory of Sophia Bailey, daughter of the above named Thomas and Sophia Bailey, who died November the 10th, 1910, aged 75 years. And we can't work out what the last bit says because it's buried. As you can see, there's quite a bit of information about William and his family here. The parents both appear in the burial register, although Sophia is described as of South Mims, late of Hadley. So it looks like she moved away, perhaps to live with one of her children after she was widowed, but came back to be buried with her family. Her daughter Sophia is in the burial register too. Her address is given as 20 Puller Road in Barnet. There is a fair chance that the family is still under that gravestone. Looking closer into central London, matters are much more complicated by the sheer number of people who live there. Parishes often had to find additional burial grounds. I'm going to talk about St James Piccadilly, which is in Westminster, as an example. The burial registers of St James date from 1685 to 1853 and are held at Westminster Archives. There were two churchyards actually attached to the church. Immediately to the west of the church on Jermyn Street was a burial ground, now much raised above ground level due to the sheer number of bodies, and known as the Green Ground. This was converted into a garden of remembrance after the Second World War and is now called the Southwood Garden. On the Piccadilly side of the church was a burial ground which was called the North Churchyard. References in the vestry minutes suggest that from the middle of the 18th century at least, this area has been paved over and that burials were made in the vaults beneath the paving. This churchyard is often used as a site for a little market nowadays. A list of memorials from the churchyard, which were then still legible, were published in Notes and Queries in 1913 and can be seen online as an e-book. The memorials inside the church were recorded on its own website. In 1693, the vestry bought the sublease of half an acre at the north end of the Paulitz Garden for use as a burial ground. The land, already enclosed by a brick wall, was located between Poland Street and Marshall Street, and it became the Poland Street Burial Ground. You can see it here on Faden's 1819 revision of Forward's Plan of London, a very useful map, which is available for free on the Romantic London website. One really good thing about this map is that you can switch to a street map or current satellite view to see what exactly is there now. The burial ground is right next to Carnaby Market, so more or less where Carnaby Street is nowadays. By 1733 it was full. Land immediately to the west in Pesthouse Close was then leased by Lord Craven to St James Parish Vestry as an extension to the overcrowded Poland Street burial ground. Earl Egremont recalled a vestry discussion from May 1733 about this new piece of ground in his diaries. The land was said to be able to hold 12,000 bodies and, quite revoltingly, that these would rot at a rate so that 800 new bodies per year could be buried there. Eventually, the St James Workhouse, which was built on part of the site in 1725, covered the burial ground completely. By 1870, that had gone too, and a chapel occupied part of the site. Maybe the Craven Chapel? So if your ancestor is mentioned in the burial registers was at James Piccadilly between 1693 and 1733, they may have been buried here. Yet more space was needed by the parish for burials, but there was no space for another one near to the church. So an extra parochial burial ground in the Hampstead Road was obtained by a 1788 Act of Parliament. St James's Chapel there was constructed in 1791 and the ground was used for burials until 1852. In 1887, the site was laid out as a public garden, known as St James Gardens. Part of the ground, which was initially rectangular, was taken to build Euston Station. Unfortunately, the rest was closed to the public in June 2017, as the land is required for HS2, new high-speed railway linking London with cities in the north of the UK. All human remains have been exhumed, but no further details are available at present. There are burial ledgers dated from 1790 to 1853, a poor burial ledger dated 1789 to 1828, and a day book of burials from the workhouse for the whole of the year of 1853 at Westminster Archives. There are many other records, including a plan of the third burial ground, which occupants of burial spaces identified. Details of the gravestones, which date from 1789 to 1853, were recorded by Cansick in 1884, and again by us, and now appear in our booklet series of monumental inscriptions. The vaults of St James Chapel, Hampstead Road, were cleared in 1964, prior to the chapel, then in a dangerous condition, being demolished. The remains were reburied at Brookwood Cemetery in Woking in Surrey in 1964. Other parishes which needed supplementary space have the original churchyard augmented by a nearby burial ground, instigated either by the local burial board or a private company. Let's have a look at Tottenham. The burial registers of All Hallows date from 1557 to 1901, and the monumental inscriptions in the churchyard were recorded by us in the 1980s. The churchyard at All Hallows closed in 1857, but local people still needed to be buried. So Tottenham Burial Board bought 5 acres of land at White Hart Lane, and this was opened in 1858. 2 acres were left unconsecrated for non-conformist burials. The cemetery was extended in the 1880s and again in 1913, and now covers a massive 62 acres. It is operated by Dignity Funerals Limited, who are based at Enfield Crematorium and who have all the records. Enfield Crematorium itself was opened in 1938 by the Tottenham and Wood Green Burial Board on the Great Cambridge Road and is one of the largest in Greater London area. Wood Green Cemetery opened in 1996, also operated by Dignity Funerals. These are all connected to the ancient parish of Tottenham and may be the resting place of local residents. Tottenham Park Cemetery is another private cemetery and was opened in 1912 in Enfield. Their registers are held at the cemetery, which can be searched by writing to their head office at Orsett in Essex and providing the full name of the deceased and date of death or burial, along with a £35 fee. By the way, if you had a relative longer ago in Tottenham, there is a beautifully illustrated and well-researched catalogue to the brasses in All Hallows Church, with a little history about each of the people commemorated and their families. There is also a section on the 20 lost brasses whose content had been luckily recorded previously by various organisations. This book was produced by the Monumental Brass Society in 2018. Another example is the ancient parish of Greenford, well, the parishes together really, Greenford and Perivale, which are also known as Greenford Magna and Greenford Parva. The burial register for Holy Cross in Greenford dates from 1539 to 1976, and those from St Mary at Perivale from 1720 to 1988. Monumental inscriptions in the church and churchyard of St Mary, Perivale were produced on microfiche by us in 1992. A copy of this is at Ealing Local History Centre. Typescript copies of monumental inscriptions in Greenford and Perivale are at the Society of Genealogists. A private cemetery, Greenford Park Cemetery, was opened here in 1902 on former farmland. People from Hanwell were allowed to be buried here from 1905. Council took over the running of the cemetery, and from 1967 it has been administered by Ealing Council. The burial registers are at the cemetery. You can request a search from them, but it will cost you £16. And they are online at Ancestry, which also costs you, and Find a Grave, which is a free but not complete. You can still be buried here, but must be a resident of the borough. Other records of this cemetery, cash books and so on, are unexpectedly at Hackney Archives, where they are held by those of the Abbey Park Cemetery Company. As the population of Greater London increased, many of the ancient parishes divided, with daughter churches being built, but in general, these only catered for baptisms and marriages and not burials. Where daughter churches did have burials, these of course are shown in their own burial registers, and the burials would have taken place in their own graveyards. There are about 45 of these. Finchley is an example of this. Burials in St Mary's Churchyard at Church End, Finchley, or Finchley Central for tube fans, are recorded in the burial registers, which date from 1558 to 1843. These gravestones here are from St Mary's Churchyard. The registers of daughter church Holy Trinity in East Finchley date from 1849 to 1976. There are various indexes to graves at Holy Trinity covering the entire span of the burial registers and both the old and new parts of the churchyard in the parish chest at LMA, as is a loose leaf grave register for this churchyard. St John the Apostle at Whetstone is in the north of this parish, and burial registers date from 1835 to 1922, but there isn't a burial ground surrounding the church, so I'm not sure where these people are actually buried. The burial registers are apparently on Ancestry, so I looked up John, who died at Whetstone between 1850 and 1890, but nothing came up. Further investigation is needed here, I think. Our sister society, West Surrey Family History Society, brought out a CD of London and Middlesex burials in 2013, which consists of over 100,000 burials from 42 parishes, including 23 in our area, and has 7,740 burials from Finchley, dating from 1560 to 1679, and from 1701 to 1812, and 407 from Holy Trinity from 1849 to 1866. A copy of this is at the Society of Genealogists, and obviously it can also be bought from West Surrey FHS. Snell recorded the monumental inscriptions at St Mary in the 1880s. Crouch Hall did them again in 1908, and we recorded the monumental inscriptions of all three churches in the 1980s. The SOG has the Crouch Hall archive and a file of MIs reprinted from the Barnet Press and Finchley Borough News, dated March 1935 to March 1936. Regarding the 115 parishes inside the City of London, their tiny graveyards were overwhelmed during the Great Plague of 1665, and plague pits were dug outside the city walls in order to cope with the number of dead. Those buried in the churchyards were recorded in the parish registers, but there was no ceremony or record for those buried in the plague pits. Their locations are often unknown and have long since been built over. The next year, the Great Fire of London destroyed or damaged many of these churches, and 35 were never rebuilt. Of course, the Blitz didn't help either. The churchyards, however, often survived and can still be seen as tiny parks, such as this one in Gresham Street, which was the graveyard of St John Zachary. A survey of the burial grounds of the city churches, showing the name of the parish, the situation of the burial ground, its area, total number of interments, and number of burials in 1848 is at LMA. Most were full by about 1820. An Act of Parliament of 1832 established a general cemetery company, the interment of the dead in the neighbourhood of the metropolis. This was the first of the large commercial cemeteries which were established by private enterprise, and it was at Kensal Green. It covered 72 acres of land with separate chapels for Anglicans and Dissenters, and opened in 1833. So it's the only burial place to consider for a burial before 1837, apart from other churchyards. 6 other cemeteries were established around London by various companies within 10 years, and these are known as the Magnificent Seven. The other 6 can be seen on this chart, along with another 37 cemeteries which have opened since. New legislation in the 1850s established burial boards across the country, and these public authorities provided most of these new cemeteries. Several of them had contracts with individual parishes. Several of them have reinterments from other places. For instance, some 20 City of London burial grounds were cleared from about 1893, and remains were reburied at Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey. Cremation became legal in 1884, and Golders Green Crematorium opened in 1902. Subsequently, crematoria have been added to many cemeteries. So I'm coming to the end of this talk, and I hope you have a few more ideas as to where you might find information about your London, Westminster or Middlesex ancestors' burial place. I have not had time to mention very much at all about nonconformist burials, nor Jewish or Roman Catholic ones, but you will be able to find out about any of these which are in our area, covered by our ancient parishes, together with detailed information about all of our Church of England burial grounds in our parish research guides. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.